Welcome to Stories I Know. If you're just joining us, we'd love for you to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. A fleeting moment can ignite our passion to weave even more tales. Kindly give this video a thumbs up, and now, let us embark on the tale. This is a situation I never imagined I would encounter. In a quaint little town, I nurtured aspirations of a straightforward and joyful existence. I tied the knot with my college sweetheart, James, when we were both youthful and brimming with optimism. We may not have possessed much, but we had one another, and that seemed sufficient, or so I believed. In retrospect, the indicators of what lay ahead are clear, yet in that moment, it was beyond my imagination. Upon moving into the quaint little house we rented, I had the opportunity to meet Mr. George, our landlord. The dwelling may not have been grand, but it belonged to us. It possessed a delightful allure, a quaint garden, and a charming little backyard that I cherished. James and I felt a surge of enthusiasm as we embarked on this new chapter in our lives. Mr. George was a gentleman of advanced years, in his early 60s. His face radiated warmth, a smile always lighting up our encounters. He was the type of landlord who would occasionally drop by to ensure that everything was in order with the house. The memory of his first visit to repair the broken fence lingers vividly in my mind. He exhibited such courtesy, inquiring if we required anything, and consistently engaging in light conversation about the transformations the neighborhood had undergone throughout the years. At that time, it didn't seem significant to me. He was simply a warm, older gentleman. However, a gradual transformation began to unfold. With James's job requiring him to be out of town more frequently, I found myself increasingly alone in the house. It was during these moments that I started to perceive Mr. George from a fresh perspective. He would drop by unexpectedly more frequently, occasionally to inspect the house, other times simply to engage in conversation. Initially, I believed it posed no threat. Ultimately, he held the position of our landlord. Yet, as time passed, I started to sense a change in the way we communicated. One afternoon, while tending to my garden in the backyard, Mr. George happened to pay a visit. He had started to visit more often, and while I appreciated his presence, there was an unsettling quality to his arrivals that I couldn't quite shake. He consistently exhibited kindness, yet there was a subtle intensity in his gaze that stirred a sense of unease within me. On that specific afternoon, he lingered more than he typically would. We discussed the weather, the garden, and eventually delved into the essence of life. In those moments, I started to perceive a unique intrigue in his demeanor. "Do you find joy in this place?" he inquired that day, his gaze upon me evoking a sense of vulnerability. I found myself uncertain about how to respond. I was certainly pleased with James, yet I began to sense a growing distance between us, particularly due to his extended hours at work. There were moments when I experienced solitude, even in his presence. However, I was reluctant to confess that to Mr. George, at least not verbally. I offered a smile and a nod, attempting to dismiss the thought, yet Mr. George persisted. At times, he remarked, it can be simple to overlook the significance of having someone to converse with, to sense that someone is genuinely paying attention. The words escaped his lips with a haunting resonance that sent a chill coursing through me. His words hung in the atmosphere, echoing even after his departure. I dismissed it, reassuring myself that it was merely an innocent exchange. However, as Mr. George visited more frequently, I began to observe nuanced changes in his demeanor. His compliments, once light and carefree, started to bear a significance I wasn't accustomed to. He would remark on my appearance, noting how well I cared for myself and how I kept the house in order. Initially, I believed his actions stemmed from simple kindness, but it quickly became apparent that he was observing details that seemed to escape everyone else. One evening, James found himself on a business trip. On a serene night, I found myself nestled on the couch, engrossed in a book, when suddenly, the doorbell chimed. Surprised by the unexpected presence, I paused momentarily before responding. As I swung the door open, Mr. George greeted me with a warm smile. "I happened to be nearby," he remarked, "so I thought I'd drop in and check that everything was okay." I offered a courteous smile, taking a step back to allow him entry. His unannounced visits had become a regular occurrence, so I didn't give it much thought. He entered the living room, and our conversation flowed, just like it always did. Yet, on this occasion, an unusual tension seemed to hang in the atmosphere. His gaze held an unsettling quality that sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't anything blatant, just a glance, a prolonged stare, yet it was sufficient to send my heart into a frenzy. During our conversation, Mr. George positioned himself nearer to me than he typically does. The distance between us seemed to diminish, and his presence grew increasingly tangible. I recalled chuckling uneasily at his words, attempting to dismiss the increasing unease in my heart. I reassured myself that he was merely being cordial, convincing myself that I was overreacting. However, as if attuned to my unease, Mr. George leaned in a bit closer and rested his hand softly on the arm of the couch. "You know," he said, "it's uncommon to encounter someone like you. A person who truly pays attention. A person with genuine concern." The phrases appeared harmless at first glance, yet there was an unsettling quality in his voice, a certain inflection that sent shivers down my spine. I felt the urge to distance myself, to express my discomfort, yet I held back. Instead, I chuckled awkwardly and drew my legs close to my chest, attempting to establish a barrier between us, even if it was merely a physical one. Mr. George observed the change in my stance, and for a brief moment, an unspoken tension hung in the air between us. He gazed at me, his eyes gentle, yet there was an underlying intensity that I couldn't overlook. "I didn't intend to make you feel uneasy," he murmured, his tone soft. "I wanted to take a moment to express my appreciation for you. Olivia, you truly are one of a kind." The way he uttered my name left me momentarily breathless. My heart raced within me, and I found myself at a loss for words. I felt the urge to speak, to utter something that might ease the heaviness in the air, yet the right words eluded me. I felt as though I were ensnared in time, immobilized and unable to move. Just as I was about to speak, Mr. George rose to his feet. With a warm smile, he remarked, "I suppose I should let you return to your evening." There was an oddity in the smile, an elusive quality that I couldn't quite identify. "I wanted to reach out and see how you're doing." I nodded, my throat parched, and observed him as he departed from the house. As the door clicked shut behind him, I released a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I remained seated, my gaze fixed on the door, as time seemed to stretch endlessly, grappling with the bewildering events that had just unfolded. I had never experienced such inner turmoil before. A part of me longed to confide in James about everything that had transpired, yet another part held back, gripped by shame and fear of his potential judgment. I aimed to avoid any complications. I aimed to avoid causing him any doubt or, even worse, provoking his anger. However, the deeper I delved into my thoughts, the clearer it became that I could no longer overlook the emotions Mr. George was stirring within me. It felt off, and I had no intention of fostering it. Still, I couldn't dismiss the sense that his visits held deeper significance than he was revealing. What was I meant to do? With each passing day, Mr. George's visits grew increasingly regular. Whenever he visited, a familiar wave of discomfort and unease washed over me. I attempted to dismiss it, yet it was increasingly difficult to overlook. He had an undeniable quality that sent my heart racing, leaving me puzzled about the reason behind it. I understood the importance of caution, realizing that I mustn't allow circumstances to spiral beyond control. Yet, I sensed that beneath the surface, a transformation was unfolding. I was unaware of the depths it would reach. As the days stretched into weeks, the unease between Mr. George and myself intensified. I had yet to share with James the peculiar encounters with our landlord. A part of me worried that he might not grasp what I was trying to convey, or, even worse, that he could become angry and upset with me. In the end, I was merely attempting to be amicable, wasn't I? It was merely casual conversation, nothing deeper, correct? I repeated that to myself every time Mr. George arrived at the house unexpectedly, attempting to dismiss my increasing discomfort. Yet, the discomfort had grown too significant to dismiss any longer. The image of Mr. George lingered in my mind, particularly the way his gaze had met mine and the subtle brush of his fingers against the armrest of the couch during that visit. It felt as though he was reaching out, attempting to forge a bond that transcended the usual boundaries of neighborly or landlord-tenant interactions. I found myself revisiting that moment repeatedly in my thoughts, with each replay intensifying the tension inside me. On a serene Tuesday evening, I stood solitary in the kitchen, meticulously chopping vegetables for dinner. Cooking had always been a source of joy for me, but tonight it seemed more like an obligation than a solace. My mind wandered, and an unsettling sense lingered that an event was on the brink of unfolding. As I began to season the chicken, the familiar chime of the doorbell interrupted my thoughts. My heart raced with excitement. As I gazed through the kitchen window, I spotted Mr. George at the door, his familiar warm smile lighting up his face. It had been a few days since I last saw him, and while I ought to have felt a sense of relief, an unsettling knot began to twist in my stomach. With a swift motion, I dried my hands on the towel, inhaled deeply, and approached the door. "Good evening, Olivia," Mr. George greeted with a bright smile as I opened the door. "I trust I'm not causing any disruption." "Absolutely not," I responded, managing to put on a smile. I moved aside to allow him entry, and he walked into the house with ease, as if it were the most ordinary occurrence imaginable. He cast a quick look around, his gaze momentarily resting on the kitchen where I was busy preparing dinner. "The aroma in the room is delightful," he remarked, his eyes fixed on the dish I was preparing. I acknowledged the compliment with a nod, feeling uncertain about how to reply. "It's merely a straightforward meal for dinner, nothing out of the ordinary." "You always say that," Mr. George chuckled, "but you have a knack for turning the simplest things into something extraordinary." The compliment was pleasant, I suppose, but it carried a different weight coming from him. It was different from the praise I had received from friends or even James. There was a heaviness in his gaze, as though he perceived something within me that transcended mere concerns of the meal or the dwelling. An unsettling sensation crept over me once more, yet I made an effort to dismiss it. "I appreciate it," I replied, dismissing it lightly. "Is there anything you require?" "I take it you're here to look into something?" Mr. George's expression changed subtly. He appeared to pause momentarily before replying. "I was hoping we could have a brief conversation. It feels like ages since we last engaged in a meaningful dialogue." I found myself taken aback. We had consistently shared cordial greetings whenever he visited, yet we had never engaged in an extended dialogue. I was aware he had been around frequently, but I didn't anticipate his desire for a more profound conversation. A wave of anxiety washed over me, yet I nodded regardless. "Absolutely, we can take a moment to sit together." I guided him into the living room and motioned for him to settle onto the couch. I positioned myself in the chair that had become my usual spot during our TV time, facing him directly. An uncomfortable stillness hung in the air before Mr. George broke the silence, his voice carrying a weight I had never encountered from him before. He started off at a leisurely pace. "I've been reflecting deeply on existence lately, contemplating the ways in which everything evolves with the passage of time. It's simple to become immersed in the routine, to overlook what truly holds significance." I found myself uncertain about the direction he was taking with this. "I understand your perspective," I replied with care. "Life often becomes a whirlwind, making it challenging to focus on what truly matters." Mr. George nodded, his gaze probing into my own. "Precisely. However, it's crucial to keep in mind that there are moments when we must pause and ensure that we are genuinely experiencing life, rather than merely existing." His words carried an unsettling weight, leaving me at a loss for how to reply. I was completely in the dark about his implications, and I found myself questioning whether I truly wanted to uncover the truth. "Olivia," he murmured, inclining his head ever so slightly. "It's hard to put into words, but from the moment we met, there has been a unique bond between us that I can't seem to overlook. I've lost count of the moments I've reflected on our discussions, the manner in which you present yourself. Your qualities are truly exceptional, and expressing the depth of my admiration for you is no easy task." My breath hitched in my throat. His words carried warmth, yet they resonated like a revelation. The way he uttered those words sent a jolt through me, but it was far from pleasant. A wave of confinement washed over me, leaving me uncertain of my next move. Thoughts whirled in my head, searching for the right words, anything to ease the thick tension that hung heavily in the air. I found myself at a loss for words, my voice scarcely rising above a whisper. "Thank you for your kind words, Mr. George, but I am happily married. I share a deep affection for my husband." He appeared unfazed by what I said. He reclined in his chair, observing me intently for a moment, his face a mask of inscrutability. "I understand," he said softly, his tone tinged with regret. "I hope this doesn't put you in an awkward position, Olivia, but I can't ignore my feelings any longer." His words surged through me like a bolt of lightning. I had previously heard him voice his admiration for me, but this time felt distinct. His gaze held a profound intensity, revealing layers beneath the surface. A surge of fear and confusion washed over me. This had evolved beyond a mere friendly landlord's inquiry. This was an entirely different experience, one that left me uncertain about how to navigate it. "While I certainly don't wish to create any tension between you and your husband," Mr. George pressed on, "I can no longer ignore the undeniable attraction I feel towards you." I simply had to express my feelings. I found myself at a loss for words. I parted my lips, yet the words eluded me. I was reluctant to cause him pain, yet I also wished to avoid leading him on with unrealistic expectations. What action was I meant to take in this scenario? How can I convey to him that I am married and not looking to engage in anything beyond my relationship with James? At last, I inhaled deeply, my heart racing within my chest. "Mr. George," I stated with conviction, "I recognize your honesty, but I must be straightforward with you. I am devoted to my husband and our marriage. Thank you for your kindness, but I prefer to keep our relationship strictly as landlord and tenant." A lengthy silence hung in the air, and I noticed the disappointment flash across his eyes. He gazed at his hands, then gave a slow nod. He acknowledged this softly. "I apologize if my actions caused you any discomfort. That was never my aim." I nodded, a wave of relief enveloping me. The tension that once enveloped us appeared to fade, yet it gave way to a persistent sense of discomfort. The sense that everything had irrevocably changed lingered in my mind, a persistent reminder that Mr. George's emotions for me would endure, regardless of my willingness to confront them. He rose to his feet, and I mirrored his action. "Thank you for listening," he said, his voice gentle yet tinged with a trace of melancholy. "I shall allow you to enjoy your evening. I want you to understand that I honor your boundaries, Olivia. I simply wanted to share my feelings with you." I managed a smile, attempting to conceal the discomfort that lingered within me. "Thank you, Mr. George," I expressed. "Catch you later." As he stepped through the door, I lingered for a moment, gazing at the vacant spot he had just occupied. A tempest of ideas swirled in my mind. It was hard to fathom the events that had just unfolded. I was wed to James, and yet I had just engaged in this dialogue with our landlord. What was happening? And why did it seem as though my whole existence was gradually coming apart at the seams? I shook my head, attempting to dispel the uncertainties. I needed to concentrate on my journey with James, to cherish the affection and dedication we once embraced. Yet, a persistent whisper within me suggested that this was only the beginning. Following my discussion with Mr. George, I made an effort to set the whole matter aside. I hoped it wouldn't impact my relationship with James, and I certainly aimed to avoid making things more complicated with our landlord. Yet, despite my attempts to conceal my emotions, they lingered on. The weight of guilt and confusion hung in the air, leaving me in a state of perpetual second-guessing about the interaction. A few days later, Mr. George made another unexpected appearance. A wave of tension washed over me as the doorbell rang. I found myself unprepared for yet another uncomfortable dialogue, yet I understood the necessity of confronting it directly. I pushed the door open, striving to maintain my calm. "Greetings, Olivia." He welcomed me, his tone inviting yet measured. I wanted to touch base and confirm that everything is still in order with the house. I acquiesced, managing a smile. "All is well, Mr. George. I appreciate your inquiry." He appeared to pause momentarily before proceeding. I've been reflecting deeply on my previous words. It was never my intention to cause you any discomfort. I acknowledge your limits and I honor them. I simply felt the need to express everything that was on my mind. I gazed at him for an extended moment, sensing the gravity of the words he had uttered. I needed to stand my ground at this moment. Uncertainty had no place here. I appreciate your understanding, I responded, but I must be explicit. I am in a marital relationship. I am dedicated to my relationship with James, and I must eliminate any distractions. I appreciate our professional connection, but that is the extent of it. Mr. George's expression became gentler, yet a trace of sorrow lingered in his gaze. He nodded slowly, embracing my words with quiet acceptance. He acknowledged softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I apologize if I crossed any boundaries. I inhaled deeply, experiencing a wave of relief wash over me. It's all right. I simply wanted to confirm that we share the same understanding. He offered a slight, courteous nod before turning to depart. As he turned to leave, I lingered in the doorway, observing his departure, a swirl of feelings enveloping me. A sense of melancholy washed over me at the thought of how things had unfolded, yet there was also a flicker of gratitude for having established the boundaries I so desperately required. That evening, James and I gathered for dinner, and for the first time in a long while, I felt genuinely engaged. The recent events have been heavy on my mind, yet I understood the necessity of pressing on. I needed to concentrate on what was truly important: my family, my dedication to James, and the bond we cherished. Is everything all right? James inquired, observing that I seemed more subdued than normal. I forced a smile, attempting to set aside the persistent thoughts that clung to me. Indeed, just pondering. It's wonderful to have you back. He returned the smile, gently squeezing my hand. It feels wonderful to be back in familiar surroundings. In that instant, it became evident that despite the chaos and intricacies of human feelings, my focus was unmistakably defined. I needed to safeguard the bond one shared with James. I refused to allow anything or anyone to obstruct my path, and I was certain, regardless of the challenges, we would navigate it side by side.